Welcome to the Real Chili Podcast.
And the Golden Eagles of Marquette University in Milwaukee are bound for the Final Four for only the third time ever.
5 seconds left. Marquette down by one, trying to avoid the upset. Blue the drive, the left hand. It's good. 1 second to play. Vander Blue has put Marquette in front by one.
And I want to win every day as basketball players, as students, and I want to win every day, most importantly, as people.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Real Chili Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lavender. I'm joined by my good buddy, my esteemed colleague. He has a cold just like me, Pete Mohan. Pete, how you doing, buddy?
Doing great. Colds are all you can ask for in December.
It's a beautiful time of year to have a cold. As long as you got it kicked by Christmas, you should be okay, right?
There you go. Maybe a little eggnog.
I saw you drinking some of that vitamin C.
I got OJ with me.
Yeah, OJ.
Yep.
There you go. Folks, aside from this incredible banter that we've got going on here, we have a real treat for you on today's podcast. Among the Marquette community, the Marquette basketball community, there is one voice that stands at the top or near the top, certainly, of Marquette basketball conversation, and that's Paint Touches. And today we have some folks from Paint Touches joining us. Andrei, Greska, and a little bit later on, Ryan Jackson will be joining us. Andrei, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining.
No, thanks for having me and having us. It's a huge opportunity for us because we're, like I said, we have faces for radio and we have voices for writing. So we appreciate any and all opportunities to contribute to the Marquette community. And we appreciate what you guys do on a really regular basis.
We try to keep it regular. You know, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it comes really easily. But for Paint Touches, folks, if I would assume that this is a self-selecting audience and that if you listen to our podcast, you know what Paint Touches is. But if you don't, how long have you guys been around? How long has the site been around?
We started it our senior year, so that'd be 2012. 2011, I graduated in 2012, and then we kept it running pretty actively. Mark Stratman was one of the original founders, and he did a ton of reporting. He had a lot of contacts, so we had it going pretty good as a news platform. But then he moved on to bigger and better things with NBC Sports Chicago. So it's basically been me and Ryan, just whenever we have time and availability. But yeah, it's been 7 years running now, which feels old for the internet, and
yeah.
It is old, I guess.
Yeah.
In addition, on their behalf, that they provide excellent analysis from a statistical standpoint as well. If you like digging into the nitty gritty, you know.
Yeah, I think that's the niche we kind of figured out, because I'm very bad at cultivating sources, and I don't have any news for you. I have my hands full. I have 3 kids, so I can never I can't get the scoops. So we stick with what we can do. The Bible and KenPom, and then we try to dissect that for people to understand who might not enjoy diving into the numbers as much as we do. But yeah, I mean that's kind of what we've been sticking to, is stuff we can analyze on our own without relying on information that we don't have.
So there's a number of things that we wanted to cover, and there are specific reasons we wanted to have Andrei and Ryan on the show. And so throughout this podcast, we're going to do a couple of things. One is we want to get the take, the Paint Touches take, that Paint Touches sealed take on this Marquette basketball team, which is really turning out to be a lot different from the squad we saw last year, or really any other squad in the Steve Wojciechowski era. And then later towards the end of the pod, we're going to get into a little more of a discussion around a Big East preview and give you a sense of what teams, what players you need to look out for in Big East competition as Marquette enters that in just a couple of weeks here on January 1st with an away game in New York against St. John's. So before we get to that, let's kind of diagnose this team. We're recording this on December 19th, so Marquette's still got a couple games left in the non-con, including against Buffalo, but we're towards the end of the non-con, and so we have a relatively good sample size to gauge this Marquette team. And I think it's safe to say it was a rocky start, but there were obviously reasons for that. And it seems like this team and this coaching staff has found a bit of a I don't know if they've hit their cruising altitude, but they're finding some leveling off. Andrei, would you agree with that assessment? Where do you kind of generally see this team right now?
Yeah, 100%. I think as a team, they understand who they are now, because going into the season, I'm guessing you guys and all the pundits in the world said, okay, this is going to be another great offense. You have Marcus Howard, you have Sam Hauser, you have a little Hauser coming. They're going to put lots of points on the board. Can they stop anybody? And that was basically the thing that had limited their potential to be either a top half of the top 25, or even just to get into some top 25s going into the season. And that was the consensus, was, can this team stop anyone? And then you saw that stopping people wasn't as big of an issue as they thought, but they couldn't score. That has been such a role reversal from what we're used to under Wojo, particularly the past 2 years in the Hauser and Howard era. So it took, I think, time for not just the fans to adapt to what this team is going to look like and what it does look like now, but for the team to understand what they are. So going into the season, you wanted lots of threes, run and gun, fast pace. There's a lot of depth. There's a lot of people that can shoot the three. But then when you look at the numbers, I think there was a Twitter user, Andy Bukowski, that he has been advocating for a while, like, hey, this team should slow it down. This is not a fast-paced team. This is a team that can put the screws on people defensively, but can't really keep up in a run-and-gun game. So you saw against Indiana, the turnovers in the beginning led to just straight to buckets, and then the offense couldn't get going. So I think after that game and after the collapse in the second half against Kansas, I think Wojo got it. And I'm not going to criticize him because I don't know much about X's and O's in basketball. He can run laps around any one of us. But I think he got a really good feel for what his team is. And what his team is the best defense in the Big East. Like if I told you going into the season that Marquette through just the middle of December will have the best defense in the Big East, like, would you have taken that bet? Like, I would not have. Like, I thought it would be improved. I thought it would be a top 80 defense. But to be top, I think, where are they at right now? They're at 43, top 50.
What's interesting is that the offense rank and the D rank have slowly crept closer to each other. And now it's offense 32nd, defense 43rd. I think that's probably the closest it's been all season. And I think the Louisville game was huge on multiple levels. Not only did that, stem the losses and switch our momentum moving forward, giving us something positive, to bank on heading into the Kansas State game. But at the same time, we realized the big win that we had was because we won dirty. We slowed it down, won in the half-court game, and I think that maybe flipped the switch a little bit. And, it's been pretty much a similar blueprint. Wisconsin game pretty much about, and the Kansas State game. It's not like these were, Wisconsin, Virginia style basketball games that are totally grind them out. But for the most part, we've had enough defense to make our offense valuable. And I think that's really all that we can ask for.
I completely agree. And the one thing about the offense, and if you follow Paint Touches on Twitter, you probably roll your eyes every time I start off on this. There's just, outside of Marcus Howard, there is no ball creation. There's no bucket getter. Like, you can throw it into Joey a few times, and he gets to the rim very well for his age. And uses his size tremendously. He's got a deceptive speed. He puts some moves on Lure that just left him in the dust. And I'm not Lure. I'm sorry. Hap.
Interchangeable.
Showing my. Yeah. But just the way he understands and can read the game offensively, shows you why Wojo's so excited. But he's not there yet. He got stripped a couple times against North Dakota, and the turnovers have been an issue for him. And so then it goes to Sam, and Sam's not really a shot creator. Yes, he could get it in the post. He could back his defender down, and I think it started the game against North Dakota with a nice back down, turn around, mid-range kind of game. But you're not going to give him the ball with 10 seconds and say, get me something.
Well, I think you can officially become an honorable, member of the Real Chili podcast with we've said it a million times before, Marcus Howard is the creator, right? And there isn't, Sakar can do it in spots, and I think there is some I don't know if there's data, but the eye test would tell me that when Sakar plays better and gets to the hole more and finishes, we end up being a better team because he's at least somewhat of a second option. But reverting back to kind of that bigger conversation about this year and coming off of last year, what's so interesting to me is, thinking about Andrew Rousey now and his departure, changed our offense so much. Clearly has improved our defense, but that really just, has grown in my mind the outsized impact that he had as a player on this team, because it's changed so much just from last year. It's really amazing.
Yeah, and I think you can say, and I must have tweeted it or I posted it on a board, that his contribution offensively was Rousey's contribution offensively was underrated. Like, he did so much for the team and so efficiently that it was going to be difficult to replace him. However, and I hate bashing on a player, I think his negative contribution to the defense was also underrated, like just how much he hurt the team defensively. And it's not all his fault. When you have two sub-6-foot players, it's very difficult to hide either one of them, particularly when neither of them were particularly positive contributors with steals or heck, keeping their guy in front of them. Like, both of them were blow-by defenders. So yes, you lost a ton. I mean, 30% usage at 115 O rating, that's elite. You lost an elite offensive player that could score from any spot in the half court in, and he could create for himself. But the thought process was, hey, you're going to have a Chartouni type who can game manage, and that game manager, I think you might have thrown it around, or another podcast has used that for him, and I think it's very accurate, or that's what's expected of him. Unfortunately, in the game manager aspect only works if he can manage it without throwing a bunch of picks. And right now, the turnover percentage, how often he is turning it over, it's killing any potential of giving Marcus some breathers to get them a couple possessions off the ball. I think right now, last time I checked on Synergy, I think Chartouni was turning it over 66% of the time in transition, and 30% is awful. 15% is about average. So he's at 66, and in transition, where you're expected to score a little bit more efficiently than in a half court setting. So I thought I wrote about this 2 games in. I was like, hey, is it too early to worry? And obviously it was way too early. But the more we've seen is he kind of moves, or he has trouble adjusting when his body's moving faster than his mind, or his mind is moving faster than his body. It's not there. So what ended up happening is now you have one point guard, and that's about it. I guess Chartouni does handle it at times, but
well, and I would say even Joey is second point. I mean, it's mostly through the post, and sometimes Sam in the post too, but I would say that a lot more possessions are initiated in the half court through Joey even than Chartouni at times.
Yeah.
One thing too about Rousey before we move on is I think that you mentioned his usage rate being so high, and not only was, we're taking advantage of his skill set, but the difference in the roster makeup this year and the distribution of usage amongst the other players, it allows more players to develop too. It's more conducive to the situation where we have 10 guys. I mean, if Rousey's on this team, our offense would be great, but think of how much fewer shots you'd have to develop Joey and throwing the ball into the post. We wouldn't be throwing the ball into the post to Theo to develop his post game if Rousey's handling the ball on the perimeter the whole time. So I think that, there's a silver lining to everything, but I think that as you see, our team is better this year without Andrew Rousey. I think that's the TLDR right here.
Yep.
Even though he was a great player, the team is better this year, and he's not on the team. Take what you will.
Yeah, and again, I hate to be so negative about a player because he had so many fun moments, but team last year was tough to watch down the stretch because you knew, like, you have to score 90 points or there's basically no chance of winning, and that's just
stop.
No, never.
Well, you're not. Don't worry about being negative about a player. This is analyzing his game. We're doing it, without bashing the kid. He wasn't great at defense, and I think he said as much. I think he said I don't remember what the exact quote was, but I don't think he liked defense. So So we know we have a different team from last year. We think it's a better team, and despite some early bumps, this team, as we've said, seems to be finding its footing. Andrei, you mentioned that Wojo kind of realized what this team was, and since then, from the Louisville game and on, we've seen that continue to come together. I'd argue that the wins against Louisville and Kansas and Wisconsin over the second half of our non-con, that's a hell of a stretch of wins. And we're going to look back on that in March and realize, hopefully, that was an impressive stretch. But getting to my question, looking at the Indiana loss and the Kansas loss, are you both comfortable in, as those get a little bit further in the rear view mirror and we have that cushion of those wins, are you comfortable looking at those losses as the team was still finding itself and that wasn't the full Marquette team that we even see today? Because there was a lot of panic. There was a lot of finger pointing. There was some hashtag fire Wojo stuff going on, but it doesn't seem like it seems like that was far too much of an overreaction. So how are you, Andrei, how are you looking at the Indiana game? How are you looking at the Kansas game with a few weeks in between us now?
The start of the season is always ripe for overreactions because you have such few data points to go off of. So we saw two really good defensive performances to start the year, and you're like, okay, this is a team that can get stops. This is a team that has turned the corner. Obviously, the question last year was, is it a personnel issue or a scheme issue? Is it the fact that we were playing two sub-6-foot guards, or is it a fact that we're hedging screens out 20 feet past the three-point arc? I was on board to try to find a defensive specialist with that opening that and the coaching staff. I was like, hey, this hasn't been working. It's never been great with any personnel that Wojo has had. Let's find someone to upgrade that. And I think again, 1/3 of the way through the season, I have been wrong. But going back to your question of did we overreact to those particular games? I don't think it was an overreaction just because you have a big test and one of the biggest tests of the season on the road in a very historic arena against a team that's considered your peer. So it was what was the spread on that game? It was between 3 and 5. It wasn't like Marquette was some huge underdog. And when you get blown out of the building in the first, what was it was
the first 10 minutes that game.
Yeah, and it was the way that it was happening where there was just no resistance to penetration. There was poor rotations. I gotta find the name of the guy who hit those threes. I don't think he's hit
Finney. Oh no,
Finney. He's legit. I'm not gonna
transfer with curly hair.
Correct, and I'm looking it up right now. But he hit 5 threes, and he's hit 5 the rest of the season. Where it was not
Evan Fitzner.
Thank you. Right, and you saw so much reversion to what fans had hated the previous 2 years that it was natural. And I said at the time, there's nothing to take away from this. There's no positives. Burn this tape to the ground. Okay, so now Presbyterian, fine, whatever. Kansas, I don't think if you saw just the box score, didn't watch the game, didn't read anything about it. So if you just looked at the numbers, you would say, hey, this was an adequate showing. It was not a good showing. It was not a bad one. This is what they were expected to lose by, and they lost by that. You're playing the number 1 team in the country in a neutral site, whatever.
And then the finals, for listeners, the final score of that game was 77-68. So, right.
Right.
On the surface,
a 9-point loss. I think they were 8.5 or 9-point dogs. So it was an average loss against what is the best team in the country by the rankings. However, when you have a 12-point lead going into halftime, when you give up a 22 or 24 to nothing run, and just show such little fight, and that I don't like using these heart, grit, fight to analyze the game because
no resistance.
Yeah, and then very little character. You got punched in the mouth, and they laid down on the mat and didn't try to get up. Nothing that they threw out there worked, and so the game was over after 30 minutes, even though you had been up by double digits at halftime. So I said a lot of words, and the overall point being, I think fans were, yes, they were overreacting to 2 data points, but they were using 4 previous years worth of results to go into that. Nothing before that had shown that this team was good defensively when it counted, and in the 2 biggest tests to date, they were poor defensively.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was fine. Like it was overreaction, but it was fine for what we knew. Now, seeing Louisville, seeing Kansas State, seeing Wisconsin, it's easier to say, hey, it was early in the season, the team was still finding itself, and it's correct to say that, but I wouldn't fault anyone for having jumped off ship after those first 5 games.
Mohan, Bubbles was ready to switch teams and ready to stop rooting for Marquette, right? Like that was his thing. You weren't going that far overboard.
He's just that person that every little thing is a microcosm somehow.
Yeah.
But let's look at this at a larger, broader data point set. Well, I mentioned this after we did the Louisville pod, I think, in that our first tough game, we got our ass beat in 2 halves. In our second big game, we got our ass beat in 1 half, trending positively. And then in the rest of our tough games, we got our ass beat in 0 halves. So since that second half at Kansas, we haven't fell victim to that really awful half at all. And I think, part of that bringing it back full circle is understanding we're in a better position, rely on defense, run the half-court offense sets. If you look at our pace, we're right about at the average. Well, offensively, we're 74th in pace, but, not nearly as fast as we have been in previous years. So it prevents us from having those streaks where we're just not hitting our shots. Our proclivity is to want to run and be in transition. We're that type of team. That's, when they're playing against each other in practice, I'm sure they're always wanting to run and stuff like that. You got to resist that, because if you start doing that and you start taking quick shots and missing those quick shots, that's when the other team can counter and make a big run on you. And I think that that's been a major shift, is slowing it down and preventing the bleeding.
Yeah, and again, it's very easy to sort of judge based on a final score. And I think one thing we have to keep in mind, even now, even when the team has proven in multiple instances how close this team actually is to being 7-4. Like Louisville should have won the game, because you have a 1 foot tip in to beat the buzzer that goes in 95 times out of 100. That goes in, it doesn't go to overtime. You view the trip to New York as a complete loss. Now there's a lot more pressure. Louisville wasn't supposed to be that good. And against Wisconsin, a couple of free throws go the other way, and that's also a game that's a coin flip. Like, yes, Marquette showed aptitude in responding to all these runs and showed it could lock down against a good offensive team. That's one of the reasons why, and this might segue a little bit later, why I would hesitate to say that Marquette is like a clear favorite for the Big East title, because yes, the resume, if you're just looking at wins and losses, hands down Marquette has the best resume in the Big East to date. But when you dig in a little deeper, like there's a reason why Butler is ahead of them in KenPom, and there's a reason why they're kind of a middling tier team versus being head and shoulders, like the results of 3 very good victories would indicate. So while I do think there's credit in winning games, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you played well or played poorly. As long as you put that W on the board, that's all you're going to need to get into March. I do think that there should be a little bit of caution when we do take like a macro view, because it's basically 2 shots away from being a poor record versus being a great record.
Well, I will say, though, that upon reflection of the non-con, the Buffalo and Southern games notwithstanding, we've got some quality wins on the resume, a lot more than many teams in the country. I think that,
my favorite stat, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no.
Marquette has as many Tier A victories as the entire Pac-12.
There you go.
3-3 for the the Pac-12 conference, 3 for Marquette. So yeah, I mean, you can't knock that any way you want to.
Exactly. And you know what? That's what we've been asking for. We've been begging for, we want a good non-conference schedule. We want to build the resume and things like that. And so far, mission accomplished. And I was saying to Mike before we got on here, just for me, the lack of anxiety heading into the Buffalo game, this isn't a must-win for the non-conference resume at this point. I mean, obviously, I feel like we can win. It would be an excellent win, but it's not a must-win, and that is a huge difference compared to previous seasons. And it really shows that this team should, and I think does, have confidence rolling into the Big East season.
That's a great point. That just the feeling of the team, not just from a fan's perspective, but even from like a coaching staff perspective, where
right.
You can plan this game knowing that a loss isn't going to force you to win an extra 2 road games in Big East play. Like you could play to win without having to like unburden yourself of this like monkey off your back that you need a big win. Yeah, you already have those in your pocket. This would just be a seeding win versus a bubble win. I agree.
Exactly.
So you two have built this segue bridge to the Big East section of this podcast so beautifully. I'm not going to take it right now because I want to get one more question in for both of you. And so, folks, real quick, before I get to that last question here, I want to bring in Ryan Jackson from the Paint Touches website, who's joining us a bit late because he's been burning the midnight oil at work, had to put in those good hours. Ryan, thanks for joining. Glad you could jump in.
Happy to be here, gents. Big fan of the show.
So
Thank you.
So getting to this last question before we get to the Big East preview is really, we've seen this team progress. We've seen it progress from their defensive identity grow. We've seen them kind of realize what they are and realizing they have the keys to a pretty nice car. And now the question is, what do we think this team could become? Your wildest dreams, your worst nightmares. Where do you see this team potentially heading in the months ahead? For me, I don't think we've seen this team's ceiling yet. I think there are things within this offense, roles within this defense where there could be a little bit more improvement. Do I think it's astronomical? No. But I think there are still spots where players can improve and there could be more, effective teamwork together. So I think the ceiling's a bit higher, but I don't think it's a ton higher. Andrei, do you see it that way? Are there stones left unturned with this team? How do you think it breaks?
I think their ceiling hasn't altered much for me in terms of end goal being a mid-range seed. So probably anywhere between 4 and 8, I think, is accurate. However, I do think the offense still has plenty of room for improvement, just based on the fact that Sam Hauser has been great, but it doesn't feel like he's been the Sam Hauser of old. And I think a lot of that has to do with he had a whole summer of rehab and it's taken a while. So he doesn't have that same lift off his twos. But we have seen, I think the last 2 games, he's coming back a little bit. So if you could get him into the fold, again, shooting his 40%, up his shot, his usage a little bit more to get him into the 22, 23 range instead of the 18, 19 range he's been in. I think that takes a big burden off of Marcus, allows him to pick his spots a little bit better. And Sam's a very good passer too. So once you have him hitting at full cylinder like he has his whole career, I think the offensive ceiling lifts a little bit, and it'll give this team a little bit more leeway, because there's going to be defensive games where both John and Morrow get in trouble, and just there's whatever happens when you're on the Big East play on the road, weird stuff happens that you just can't expect. So while I do think – I don't think they're going to be a top 4 protected seed this year. I don't think that's in the cards. I do believe that there's still a good chunk of offensive room for improvement that's manageable with the roster at hand without some huge leaps from anyone midseason.
Ryan, do you see it that same way? Do you see this Marquette team is maybe not a top 4 protected seed, but somewhere within that 4 to 8 range? Can we bank on that, or do you see it differently?
I'm with Andrei, and I think that's a reasonable expectation of 4 to 8 seed. Going into this year, I think that's what most kind of experts were pegging us as. Maybe a few had us a little bit lower. And I haven't seen anything to change my opinion to think that's where we could end up. I do see a scenario where the offense finally clicks, and we could end up with even a higher seed in a weekend to Big East. If nothing else, the down Big East should lead to a lot of wins for us, and that could maybe gift us a higher seed. Maybe people would be even looking at us of, oh, they're a 2 seed, 3 seed, but maybe a little overrated at a 2-3 seed. I think where we currently are, 20th best team in the nation, I think that's about what we are, actually. In terms of how I could see us reaching that ceiling is, I really don't think we've seen everything that Sakar can give us yet. If you remember, there was a period at the end of last season where Sakar's scoring clicked all of a sudden. He was getting 26 points at Creighton. He was getting in double digits regularly. He had the pretty big game against Oregon in the NIT. And I really haven't seen that same life from him this year. And I really think that that's what the offense is missing. We're missing that guy besides Marcus who can take the ball, create his own shot. And I think when we find that guy besides Marcus, that just opens up an entire world of possibilities for the offense that we just haven't seen yet. I think we got a glimpse of what our offense can do in that first half of the Kansas game. I really think if there was ever a moment so far that we've hit our ceiling, that first half was it. Mm-hmm. But oh man, what a crash I got down to. Yeah, the second half was a thing. I blocked it out mostly, but
I think it might have been you guys on Twitter who said when you were looking at our O rating on KenPom, you're like, what is still propping this team's O rating up? Because when you look at the defensive ratings, individual indicators, there's clear reasons why our defensive team has performed well. We've held teams to low shooting percentage. We had pretty high block percentage. So that seems more obvious, but there's not anything really statistically propping us up offensively at the moment other than our performance in the past and the algorithm built in for future games. So I think that, just looking at the raw numbers, I think that there's some positive regression to be had in the 3-point shooting range. We're only at 35.9 right now. I mean, by the end of the season, I wouldn't be surprised if we were up to 37, 38 based on who our shooters are and things like that. So I just beyond, the way that these pieces come together, I think that there's just some, we've had a lot of shots rim out, it seems like this year from three that, are open shots, and that doesn't necessarily show up in the numbers other than, seeing then we're probably shooting below average. So I think that there's some luck components there. And there's always just going to be so much growth with such a young team that I'm personally excited to see, like you said, who is that guy that can take the ball to the rack and diversify this offense a little bit.
My personal opinion it does feel like a lot of shots have just rimmed out, like Sam Hauser going 0 for 6. Like, there's other instances too. I think it's the Pfizer form rims. I just think those things are so breaking. Yeah. I think they're still working.
The shooting background.
Yeah, exactly. It's that student body, that crazy student body behind that. All right, so let's transition to a little bit of conversation about the Big East Conference and what Marquette fans can expect to see, on the schedule. Paint touches you guys have done. Both of you have published articles, one just in the past couple of days, and Ryan earlier this year, really doing some deep dives into what we can expect from the Big East. We should know, and I think it's been mentioned, that Marquette has been pegged nationally as, if not one of the top challengers for the Big East, certainly one of the top 2 or 3. Villanova's continued improvement. They had a hell of a showing at Kansas. We'll see how they continue to go. But Marquette is certainly one of those 2 or 3 teams in the mix, nationally mentioned, for challenging for the Big East title. So, with that being said, I want to start off with this. Andrei, Ryan, the article y'all published today, everybody go read it. It's about the tiers of the Big East. You indicated that Butler was the highest ranked team, at least in terms of tiers, within the Big East. And Ryan, I think you also had Kamar Baldwin at number 7 on your list of top 50 Big East players. So what is it, question to both of you, what is it you two see from Butler that kind of brings them out as one of the better teams in the Big East this year?
I'll start with this, that I think they're one of the only teams that have beat expectations like every single year, save one, I think, when Stevens left. So save for the initial year, they've beaten expectations every year. And whereas before I think there were some clear indicators that there was some improvements to be had going into the season, like I thought they'd be fine. I didn't think they would be low 20s, mid 30s in KenPom, just because I didn't think they had this anyone to create other than Kamar Baldwin. And I've been pretty wrong. Paul Jorgensen, I think he's a transfer from
George Washington.
George Washington, thank you. He's been tremendous, both in creating and scoring. Sean McDermott is very, very good. He's like a Sam Hauser-esque, where he's not going to get a shot for himself, but if you leave him open, like it's buckets right there. It's game. And they just play very solid, cohesive team defense for the most part, where they're not going to give games away. And having said that, they gave the game away against Indiana this past weekend, where they're up by 9 in the second half. And kind of collapsed down the stretch. But I think their ceiling is lower than Marquette's, if you had to ask me right now. But I think their floor might be a bit higher. But so long story short, they're probably a top 3 team. I wouldn't peg them to win the Big East, even though today, this particular point in time, they are the highest ranked team, at least in T rank.
I agree with just about everything Andrei said. Preseason, when I was looking at the Big East, I thought Butler looked like a top 3 team in conference. And that was just part of that is based on what they've done in the past. As Andrei mentioned, Butler gets pegged every year by the pundits of, oh, they can't compete in the Big East. Oh, they're going to drop from last year. And they just keep proving people wrong. And so I think it's dangerous to put Butler in the bottom half of the Big East ever. Looking at what they've done so far, they've actually kind of disappointed me from what I expected. Not hugely, but I thought they'd fare a little better in some of these games. I watched them last night. I had the split screen going with the Marquette game against Presbyterian, and watching them struggle against a team that we struggled with for a couple of minutes there, but eventually had a very comfortable margin of victory. Presbyterian was right up with them until the last few minutes. But I think they just added a midseason transfer, a kid named Jordan Tucker. He played for some school called Duke a season ago. So it gives you an idea of the potential he had there. Now, he didn't really get minutes at Duke. But any player that Coach K is willing to take a chance on is probably a good one. So he hasn't had a stellar first 2 games, only averaging about 10 minutes a game so far, but we know well sometimes it takes a while for transfers to work their way in. Sometimes they get steadily better, as we've seen from Ed Morrow, and sometimes they're Harry Froling. So hopefully, except against us, Tucker continues to bring some more to them, because it'd be nice to have another top team in the Big East.
I think I want to add one thing too that I should have added. And if you do read the article, like, you'll be able to get a little bit better. But you'll hear a lot and you read a lot that the Big East is down. This is a down year for the Big East. There's not as many top tier teams for the Big East. All is true, but just to get a gauge of what that means. Currently, compared to 1 year ago, where Butler ranks today, they would have been the 5th best team in the Big East last year, and they're currently top of these T rank rankings. Mm. So there's no elite team to be found. It's just not going to happen. There's not enough games. There's not enough opportunities for advancement. It's going to be a lot of beating up against each other. So yes, Butler is maybe one of the best teams, but comparatively to what the league has been, it doesn't mean the same thing. There's no number one seed to be had this year out of the Big East. So you're going to see a lot of teams beat the best team, and it's not that those teams are particularly good. It's just there's no elite team to be found.
Beyond Marquette, I think that Villanova really is the biggest wild card here. It's a team that's totally different from the championship squads we've seen over the previous 3 years. Not nearly as talented and not as experienced. And even their style of play has changed. Last year they were about, nationwide average for tempo, and now they're damn near dead last, 345th, I think, in tempo. So playing a real slow pace of play, but they still have some good players. Eric Paschal's excellent player that they've been running their offense through. He's an exciting player to watch. Villanova is intriguing to me, first of all, because Jay Wright is the coach. Yeah. And I think that's part of the reason that Butler continues to be so good is their coaching standard at that school. But Jay Wright is an excellent coach, maybe the best coach in the country. And, he's going to find a way to mold what he's got. I think that Villanova still has a chance to be the number one team in the league. I think that it'd be crazy to bet against them. But I still think that as of right now, they look like they're, on par with a Marquette or a Butler. And they've had some tough losses. They were right there with Kansas, though. They had a chance to win that game. So clearly a good team in Nova. But I have no idea where Villanova could end up. I'm interested to hear what you guys think about them.
I watch Villanova a lot. I think I watched them almost as much as I watch Marquette. I lived in Philly for a couple of years, and I got to see some of their campus. I really like the school and the program.
It's a nice campus.
Yeah, no, it is. But as a team this year, they don't have the three-point shooting to run what they have the past 4 or 5 years. It's just not there. You can't rely on Phil Booth to hit big shots. Paschal shoots way too much from the perimeter than he should. Connor Gillespie, good for him. He's had a couple good games, but he's not an Archie clone. He is not someone who was going to hit big-time buckets. And my personal I was a huge Joe Cremo advocate when the free agency came around in grad transfer season. He put up some big numbers. I thought he'd slot right in. He'd perfect style of play, and he just. I mean, if we are critical of Chartouni, I can't imagine what we would be saying about Cremo in that same position, because he's been a great player his whole career, and now he's barely getting minutes, and the minutes he has gotten are not productive at all. So when you take that lack of perimeter scoring ability, specifically for a team that basically set records last year, yes, different personnel, but just the same mindset, it changes the way they have to play, and it does not suit what they have, because they don't have Paschal is an inside presence, but he likes to attack from going outside in more than he does as a back to the basket kind of guy. They have had defensive issues adapting to all these new players, to Jay Wright's schemes, and just overall, I have been very, very disappointed, even relative to the decreased expectations we had going in with Villanova.
Ryan, as you put together your top 50 players in the Big East this year, did it feel weird and wrong and just unnatural to not have a Villanova player in the top 10?
I did have one Villanova player in the top 10. I missed that. Eric Paschal, I think I slotted in there at number 5. I think something like that. I'd have to go back and check.
I missed it. Yep, you did.
Yeah,
all right.
It did, but it felt wrong to only have one. Let's be honest. I'm pretty sure the year before, I think I had 3 of them in the top 10, and the rest were in the top 25. Dante DiVincenzo was, I think, 22, and he's lighting it up in Milwaukee now. Well, he's playing for Milwaukee now. Yeah. That's more accurate. I think Andrei hit the nail on the head with the lack of outside shooting, and so because of that, you all talked about how their game has changed. They've slowed the tempo down. For lack of a better way of saying it, they're not playing the Villanova way, and I think that's leading to some dysfunction. a lot of the expectations people had for them was based on the assumption that Javon Quinterly was going to come in and be the next great Villanova point guard, and that just has not materialized, and it may even be a locker room distraction at this point. So I think without that dominant point guard, which they've had forever in that system, I think that's what's really slowing them down. I know Phil Booth is a combo guard. He is not a true point guard. Colin Gillespie is a player, but like Andrei said, he's not at the level that Villanova has been used to. And I think without that dominant point guard who both makes his teammates better and also can score the ball at will, I'm just not sure that Villanova's system can work. They have some nice pieces. I think Jay Wright whips this team in shape because Jay Wright is one of the best coaches in the country, and he will have them playing to win the Big East still. But I see no reason why Marquette can't play toe-to-toe with those guys this season.
So if we're going by the Paint Touches Bible of tiers, A and B and things like that of the Big East, Marquette is really lumped in the third tier, tier 3A, with Villanova, with Creighton, with Seton Hall, and with St. John's. So of those others that we haven't discussed, Creighton, Seton Hall, and St. John's, does one of those teams stand out as particularly threatening, a team that you think can make the jump or make the leap and really challenge Marquette, near the top of the Big East?
Well, I'll just start by saying that, all things considered, from looking at the watching the non-conference, this feels kind of like a 12-6 Big East team. And in my head, I don't know if that's calibrated to past Big East competition levels, and I should be adjusting that up based on the decreased performance of some of these teams in the non-conference. But I think that it's one of those situations where 12-6 could make you first place or make you fourth place. And I think that remains to be seen how that, the top 3 to 4 to 5 teams perform. Obviously, Creighton's still a pretty decent team. They didn't really win in any of their important games. They beat Clemson on neutral court, but like the rest of their big ones, they lost. But I still think that, winning at Quest Center is going to be a difficult task for us. Even though we've had past success there, it's going to be a tough place for us to win. So I think that there's a lot of teams, St. John's has an amazing player in Shamori Pons. He can go off and win a game on his own. That very well could happen on New Year's Day, that we could lose just because of his performance. So there's clearly – it's going to be great television. I think that FS1 is due to make some money this year because the games across the Big East are going to be excellent. I'm going to get in trouble for watching too much basketball, I think. So I don't know about you. I really don't know who's going to jump out.
Looking at that group of teams, I really think the one that should be able to jump out, and it's a big emphasis on the should, is St. John's. I really think of those 3 teams, they have the most talent to work with. You already mentioned Shamori Pons. He is the best player in the Big East this year, in my opinion. He has this ability to go into video game mode where it's just absurd the amount of points he can put up and the things that he can do with the basketball. So he can win them a lot of games. And, supporting him, you have a plethora of really talented wings in Harone, Justin Simon, Figueroa has been an excellent addition for them from the JUCO ranks. A lot of transfers on that roster that have really worked out well for them. Like, now I think about it, their entire roster, other than Pons and Trimble, I think is transfers. And so there's so much talent there, but I just don't know how all these pieces fit together. You've got, I think, 7 guys between 6'3" and 6'7", and only one of them is 6'7". The rest are all 6'5" or shorter. And so I just don't know if you can win with that kind of balance in the Big East, but if they figure it out, they have more talent than everyone else. They do have a guy who's been injured, Sidi Kaida, who is a transfer from South Carolina. He didn't do much of anything at South Carolina. He was I think a 10-minute a game, 1.2 rebound kind of guy. And he didn't do anything in his first 2 games for St. John's. But he does have size, and he was playing hurt. So if he comes back and can be a reliable post presence, then maybe Mullins figures out how to make this team full of switchables work together. I keep saying they've got the talent. They just need to figure out how all those pieces fit.
Well, you said you don't know how these pieces fit together, and got to be honest, I don't know if Chris Mullen knows how they fit together either. And I think that's always the St. John's challenge. We're starting to get a little short on time here. Andrei, of those teams of the St. John's, Seton Halls, Creightons of the world, do you see a team? Do you agree with the St. John's, or do you see another team kind of sticking their head above the rest?
Yeah, I definitely agree with St. John's. They have the most potential, and I think they would be the safest bet if you were to bet on any of the 3. But I will plug, if you are missing out on that all offense, no defense high from the past 2 years, definitely watch Creighton, because they have taken the mantle of can't guard a lick but will shoot you out of the gym. They have a lot of fun pieces, but they do not. I mean, they've shown it time and again. They have not been able to seal the deal. Against Ohio State, against Gonzaga, against Nebraska, against Oklahoma, they've lost their 4 big games. So I would go with St. John's. Seton Hall, I had them pegged much lower than I think most. I didn't think that would work, but the collection of talent. But Miles Powell has been so good in such big moments, and they've gotten big contributions from Mamu and Kale and Quincy McKnight, a transfer from I have no idea where. Sacred Heart, thank you. That I don't think they're going to be contending for the top, but it does lend me to believe that Kevin Willard isn't as bad of a coach as I have been pegging him for the last however many years. But yeah, I thought he was going to bounce after last year, because I thought nothing was coming back other than Powell. But they beat Kentucky, and they're going to hang their head on that most of the year, I'm guessing. But yeah, St. John's is where I'm at.
So one more team that I want to make sure we give a little bit of credit to, not a huge discussion, but is it too early to call Patrick Ewing a bad coach? I have a lot of Hoya friends, Hoya faithful here in the Washington, D.C. area who insist that things are still coming together and give it time. I have no reason to doubt them. Is Patrick Ewing a good coach? Georgetown is tier 4 according to the Paint Touches analysis. They're going to have a rough year of it, right?
Yeah, that Derrickson departure, which pretty much came out of nowhere. I don't think he was on any draft radars. He didn't get drafted, but he did get picked up by the Warriors. It killed their creative element on offense, because Govan is a back to the basket kind of guy. He's not going to get the ball at the top of the paint and create for himself. James Akinjo, a freshman point guard, has been electric, but not efficient. So when you're giving someone like him, a freshman who's turning it over a quarter of the time, 26% of possessions, it's ripe for disaster, especially when you're combining him in the backcourt with another freshman in Mac McClung, dunking wonder of the world, but who is a very inefficient player and should not be getting as much time or usage as he is getting. They have very thin ball handling, and their interior game is decent, but you're just not going to win many games that way anymore. I think it's too soon to say that Ewing can't coach, but especially with the departure of Derrickson really, really putting a dent into this particular year. But I do think with LeBlanc, he's a freshman who's very underrated at this point in time, but I think you're going to hear a lot from him the next 3 or 4 years. With Akinjo, with McClung, they have the makings to be decent to good the next few years, but it's definitely not happening this year.
Yeah, and you got to keep in mind, they've got those 3 freshmen playing big minutes for them. They also got a sophomore in Jamarco Pickett starting for them. And, Jesse Govan leaves, and that's their best player after this year, but they have a clone coming in named Omar Yurtseven, a transfer from North Carolina State, who's in that same mold of a sharpshooting big man. So I see Georgetown on the rise the next couple of years. Do they ever get back to the heights they were at? I don't know. I wouldn't put money on it. But I do think they'll be trending up rather than down.
All right. You guys have convinced me to just back off my buddies for a little while and let them have their breathing room. I know how it feels to be in their spot. All right,
guarantee
fellas.
that they'll lose. Guarantee that Georgetown will lose to DePaul. So at least hit him with that.
At least hit him with that. That's, no matter how good DePaul ever gets, I think losing to DePaul will still be it.
Glass houses, guys. Glass houses.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. All right, fellas. So with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Real Chili Podcast. Before we do that, I want to throw it to you, Andrei and Ryan, for any final words you may have. I think we've covered a lot of territory just within the number of minutes we've been on this podcast. And I think we can probably all agree on the fact that there could be a really exciting season ahead for Marquette, one that ends hopefully not with a first round lost in the NCAA tournament. So, Andrei, Ryan, any final words before we sign off here today?
I'll just say this, that the Big East is so closely grouped together that I think Peter's saying that 12-6 might win, or 12-6 might be the difference between first and fourth. I think 1 through 9 will be separated by 2 games at most. So I wouldn't make too much of the rankings themselves, because even last year, 1 extra win for Marquette would have given them 3rd or 4th place versus the 7th place that they did get. But having said that, Marquette's non-conference work is what will elevate them compared to the rest of the Big East. So it's a huge weight off the coaching staff's back, and it'll be important down the stretch come March.
I think the only thing I have to say is buckle up. It's going to be bumpy at times. There's a bit of a cluster in the middle of the Big East, and we've got a good team, but this isn't the shoot the lights out offense anymore. We seem to be a little more defensive focused, grind it out. So there's going to be a lot of close games. So tip your cardiologist well. It will be stressful at times. I also want to mention, hope that Greg Elliott recovers nicely from this injury. I think the red shirt is a smart decision, but definitely was hoping it wasn't serious enough to warrant him taking an entire year off.
No doubt. Yeah, that's a good point to add in there about Greg. Well, with that, folks, we're going to wrap up this episode. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in to this episode of the Real Chili Podcast. We hope you have a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays with your family, with your friends. Thanks to Andrei and Ryan for joining this episode. We're big fans of your work, so appreciate you taking the time not only to join this episode, but as people who frequently struggle with balancing work and family and this. We know what you go through. We appreciate you continuing to do it, and I'm sure the same goes for all of our listeners. They feel the same way. So thanks, fellas, for joining, and we hope to have you back again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
All right, folks, signing off for Pete Mohan. I'm your host, Mike Lavender. We'll talk to you next time on the Real Chili Podcast.